As we reported earlier, Chinese President Xi is touring Latin America. One of the major highlights of his trip was last week's BRICS summit in Brazil. The BRICS include Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Now, the idea of this grouping dates back to 2001 when a Goldman Sachs asset manager named Jim O'Neill put the idea together on a piece of paper to investors. At that time, he was trying to highlight the future growth areas of the emerging economies in the world. Later, foreign ministers of the BRIC countries, before South Africa was added, met in New York City 5 years later. And the leaders of the founding four nations held their first official summit in Russia in 2009. A year later, South Africa joined, and thus the BRICS countries became the BRICS with an S, as we, of course, know them today. Now, I had a chance to catch up with Jim O'Neill recently in a wide-ranging chat. He shared with me some of his thoughts on the BRICS nations these days, in particular how he thinks the latest geopolitical concerns and uncertainty is affecting the global economy.
In some ways, the current Russian crisis highlights the fact that global governance has just not kept pace with the progress of economic change. Just because Russia behaves in a way that we don't like shouldn't mean that we just say, okay, we have to forget about Russia. And I think there's some long history here. I think you have to remember that when after the breakdown of the USSR, when Yeltsin was put in charge, we mistakenly believed in the West that was going to turn Russia immediately into a Western democracy. And of course, that's why we invited them to be part of the G8. But that was a fundamental miscalculation on behalf of Washington and, to a lesser degree, London and Brussels and Berlin and so on. And because, as I'm sure some of your listeners or viewers are aware, Yeltsin was not popular in Russia, and something we need to understand still to this day, despite the controversies, that Putin is and for most of his time has been very popular with Russian people. And we can't just assume that 7 billion people around the world want to have exactly the same values and belief system as we do in Europe and the States.
If you and I were putting together a portfolio and China would have to be a part of it, what's to prevent us from putting all our money into China? What are the key risks that you're looking at there?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think at the time we're having this discussion, so many people have become so skeptical about China. I think your question implies a forward-looking thinking that is missing amongst many. So I think focusing on the new China, which I would emphasize relates to the consumer and things to do with alternative energies and the whole growth of the service sector, is worthy of a lot of investments. And indeed, I personally have made some investments that way. I wouldn't give it 100% because having been in finance for nearly 35 years, I know that there is always something you think that won't work out that way. In fact, quite often, I believe that only 60% of what you believe about the future to do with finance will work out, and that's pretty good. So I wouldn't put 100% based in my views about China, but I would put a lot there. The other reason why I wouldn't is I'm also really bullish about this new leader in India. You know, I've often joked that India should swap some things with China, in particular this obsession with their wonderful democracy, which frequently smothers effective decision-making in India. But with this guy Modi now elected, there is a mandate that's stronger than anything I've seen for over 30 years in all my professional career. And I'd be pretty bullish about India as well as China at this point. And if I had to pick within the BRICS, I'd have a lot of my allocation to China and India right now.
There's a lot of folks out there talking about it, and you know who these are, saying that China is going to collapse and all these negative things, including specifically, I should say, the property market. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah. You know, I get myself into debates with some of these famous people. I've been on platforms in the US with some of them very recently, so I'm very familiar with the arguments. You know, I think at the core of it, there's a simple philosophical thing. I think there's a lot of people in the US that simply don't want to recognize, and therefore won't recognize, that there is an alternative to the American economic model. So whenever there's some signs of something going in the wrong direction in China, they immediately pounce and say, this is the beginning of the end and there's going to be a major crisis. And specifically to this property issue, now people are obsessed about a so-called major bubble and a break of the bubble in what people call tier 2 and tier 3 cities. People, including very much often the same people, used to say the same about Beijing and Shanghai 3 years ago. But very importantly, the policymakers have done a pretty good job in pricking the property bubble in those places without making it a disaster. And what I often say back to people is, show me another country in the world other than possibly Singapore that has deliberately stopped house prices going up before it became a major problem. And I think it's not easy to do because of the complications around it, but the Chinese, by and large, are doing a pretty good job in stopping what otherwise would be a major crisis. So I don't worry about that generally as much as many other commentators seem to stress about.